Stefan Bandera. You'll see all these pictures in Kiev, in Lviv, and other cities where they have banner like he's the George Washington of Ukraine. Stefan Bandera was a Nazi collaborator who was actively involved in mass murder in World War II and assassinations prior to World War II, as leader of what was called the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. And 25 years ago, I wrote a book about how this was tied into various CIA operations. Not that anybody cared 25 years ago, but the story had to be told because it was also tied into the Republican National Committee and to the whole military-industrial complex. In other words, it was part of the brute force assault, the capability they had, given opportunities to go into Europe and take power. Now, when those spontaneous demonstrations happen, given what's known of how American intelligence agencies operate and the White House, frankly, operates worldwide, they ordered this mobilization to see if they could topple the government and make it an issue, pretending that this was about economic development in the future versus being tied to the past. And what emerged out of this was increasing pressure, where Joe Biden and I think John Kerry too went to Ukraine, and John McCain, and called for support for the demonstrators and warned the Kiev government, don't hurt these demonstrators, don't lay your hands on these demonstrators because they're like freedom fighters and so forth. While in the demonstrations you could see the swastikas, you could see the white supremacist symbols, you could see the Confederate flag from the United States. You could go to stormfront.org and see the connections to David Duke and Don Black. It was obvious to anyone. The New York Times even did a couple of reports on it when they were in the demonstration phase. But once the Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, restructured the government, how does the U.S. State Department structure the government of Ukraine? It's part of the power combinations that the United States brought to bear. And you may remember stories where the European Union and the government in Kiev and the demonstrators were actually in multifaceted negotiations to try and come to a nonviolent solution. The United States refused to participate. And when it looked like there was going to be a peaceful resolution that kept the government in power, all of a sudden 3 units of snipers were sent at different locations and started killing demonstrators and police to try and provoke and escalate the violence. I will argue that there was only one party that wanted to sabotage those negotiations, and it was the United States. And they had internal capabilities in Ukraine, and they had external through what were called gladio operations, which were assassination and sabotage operations in every country in Europe. And it's been written about in Europe a lot, the gladio operations. You can Google it. It's like gladiator, but it just ends with the O. These were all capabilities the United States had in every country to disrupt that country. So they moved these operations in. Some of them were from other countries. They destabilized the situation. And then Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State, was quoted on she had a phone call to the American ambassador that was, let's say, overheard, recorded, and released to the world, where she said, "Fuck the EU. This is who's going to be the president of the Ukraine." This is literally what she said. She didn't say forget the EU, okay? Because they were in there trying to negotiate. Screw them. This is the hammer. And so they come in, they put, they name the prime minister, they put a whole cabinet together. In the cabinet were two critical, for the purposes of a short discussion, 2 critical elements. One was what was called the Svoboda Party, and one is right sector. Right sector, as its name implies, well, it doesn't really imply it. Right sectors wore the armband on their armbands. They wore the symbol of the 2nd Waffen SS Division, Das Reich, from World War II, because that was the most successful Nazi unit that invaded the Ukraine in World War II, and they actually won some battles against the Red Army before the Red Army kicked their ass all the way to France. So they wore these symbols, and the American press wouldn't call it what it was. They had replicates of something even the New York Times called swastika-like. The Svoboda Party, and this was the street enforcement unit of the demonstration. You couldn't deviate from they were the street operations. The Svoboda Party had 37 members of parliament, and they got control of the intelligence agency, the defense ministry, military ministry, and the education ministry of the Ukraine. They don't control the military one now for technical reasons. But right sector became the deputy minister, the leader became the right deputy minister of the intelligence agency. So they run the military intelligence and intelligence operations in the Ukraine. And the right sector are the people that show up with the chains and the clubs and the knives and the guns and start killing people. They're the ones, when there was the big fire in Odessa a couple weeks ago, they were the ones. At first it was promoted that the anti-fascist Ukrainians went out and had a street fight with them, and they were outnumbered and got pushed back into this building, and there was a mysterious fire and they all burned to death. That's not actually what happened. Right sector put on markings like they were part of the anti-fascist movement to create this apparent conflict, and then they moved the conflict over to the trade union building, and they took anti-fascists, they dragged them into the building, and they threw gasoline on them and appeared to burn them to death. But on further research, they found they were murdered prior to, and they were using the fires to mask the fact that these folks were murdered on the street and dragged in there. Not to mention they got rid of the whole trade union building. And the West is now reporting that 46 people were killed. Anti-fascists say 116 people were killed in this fact, and they burned out the whole building. That's why you employ Nazis, because reasonable people can't do this kind of degraded dehumanization. The whole reason fascism was created after World War I and empowered in Germany and so many other places was because they could conduct the kind of mass murder needed to roll back the Soviet Union. And because, I don't know anybody's interpretation here of that history, but in 1917, a workers' revolution occurred, and it had profound effects throughout the world. In Detroit, across the United States, across Europe. And fascist parties were brought into power to try and suppress the growth of that phenomenon. And if somebody has a different interpretation, I'm open to it. But in World War II, they killed 25 million people just in the Soviet Union. They killed 5 million people in Poland. Who does that except lunatics and people who are so dehumanized to wear a swastika and believe that they're so superior that they can massively exterminate people. That's the whole reason. So if the United States is in Ukraine and they're employing these forces, it's because they intend to do a massive alteration of the population in the Ukraine to have monopoly power. You're talking about massive gas and oil reserve and coal reserves, industrial development, and the most fertile agricultural land in all of Europe. Ukraine was one of Hitler's prizes that he never got. And you can read his stuff before the war. He said that's where we were going for it. The West is going after it, and as much as as much as people believe that can't find acceptable to believe that the United States and the White House and President Obama would support a Nazi operation in the Ukraine if it's in the New York Times that they're Nazis, repeatedly, and it's in the world press that they are Nazis before they took power, which wasn't a revolution, it was a coup d'etat, then, and they say they are Nazis, then what's the counter-argument? That's what we're putting in power. And that's the ruthlessness of the power in Europe today. And as in every city, right sector has been employed in disguised in National Guard units. They've incorporated in there so they can give them more training, more heavy weapons. And there is murder going on all over the East Ukraine constantly, where people are being wiped out, and the Western press will not report it. That's the summation.
Okay, all right, thank you. Tom, did you have a?
Say a couple words on the House.
Yeah, go ahead.
Detroit, you go.